All right. Let me get my screen ready to set up. I can see if anybody else is coming in. We have a few more minutes, so we can wait a bit. All right, 2 more minutes. This is the Clothing the Californio lecture, so hopefully you're in the right place. Good. Right, 1 more minute, and then I can go ahead and get started. Hopefully everybody has used Zoom before and you know how to use the chat function. Once I start the lecture, I'm going to mute everyone's microphones if you haven't already done that yourself, so that you can put your questions in that.
All right.
Phone dropped. We'll get that later. All right, about 30 more seconds on my clock anyway. Thank you all for coming. This is a new thing for me, giving lectures on Zoom, so it's going to be interesting. All right, so my clock says it is 1 o'clock, so I am going to go ahead. Oh, there's one more person. Person in, a couple more people. At the last minute. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. All right, so I need to present. Oh, 2 more people coming in. All right, you can come in. All right, so here is our first illustration. These are some sketches that were done in the 1980s, I think, that are copies of original sketches from the 1760s done by Ignacio Tirsch. And so those are the earliest representations of California, at least visual representations of what people in California were wearing at that time. Obviously, it was not done, this group of illustrations were not done by someone who was living in California at the time. So there's always that issue of the early images of California and the early sort of, especially the recollections of the Native Americans, were not done by the native peoples themselves. It's foreigners who are recording it. So there is a bit of discrepancy and extrapolation that could be necessary or that could be occurring when we're looking at these images. But this is what this is an example of one of the best images or the best series of images that we have for this early time period. So I'll go ahead and go to the next. If I can go to the next slide, that would be good. All right. So here we have maps of North America and all the different countries that owned property or claimed territory in North America. And we have one of the images of what people who had never been to California thought people in California looked like. So I'll go ahead, I have a little text that I wrote to go with it. So we're talking about age of exploration in the 1700s, the 18th century. Everybody was trying to carve out new colonies and empires for themselves out of the Americas. And Mexico was no exception. So all of the yellow that we see are in this map are Spanish territory and what they called New Spain, which was a section of their empire in the New World. And this exploration led to Spain's settling Central and South America and claiming it, and it also led to a lot of the other territorial disputes over the New World land, because it's not like there were signs on all of that land that Spain claimed saying this is Spanish land. It was that way on paper, and it was up to the individual countries to respect or not Spain's claims. And as we get through our history, if you study California history, you will know that a lot of the other countries did not respect Spain's claims unless there was someone there to support them. So we have a map and the illustration. I'm trying not to read too much from my text because it's kind of boring. And I don't know why I have to move my cursor at the bottom, but I'm having to switch slides. So here we have some more illustrations of different people's ideas of what Californians looked like. They'd never been to California, but everyone was speculating about it. So let me get back to my facts and I can tell you a little bit more about. Okay, so it doesn't say, yeah, so these two were made by two different, or one French explorer who was with a Spanish expedition coming to sailing around Asia and also drawing what he saw or thought he saw. So the English and the other publications, like French and Spanish ones, depicted Native Americans in this way. Pretty much fantastical beings. As we see later, some more accurate images of them. They're not looking quite that colorful in real life. Not quite, you know, the big hairdo and the big headdress is not necessarily accurate to the later illustrations. All right, my computer is not cooperating. All right, so here are back to the Ignacio Tirsch one of the Ignacio Tirsch illustrations. A lot of his illustrations were of people in Baja California as well as in Monterey in what is now the state of California. And his visit was in 1762. So in the following several years, he traveled up and down Baja California and into Alta California, which is now the current state of California, sketching some of the people and the places and animals that he saw. And this is one of his sketches of Native peoples outside of the mission. And because Father Tirsch was Austro-Hungarian, his illustrations are now in the Library of the Czech Republic. So we can see some of the people that he would have seen. They're wearing a lot less, not a whole lot of colorful decoration. The contemporary texts do talk about body paint, which you can't really see in this illustration, and jewelry, which you also can't really see very much in this illustration. Okay, so here we see another Native American woman, and she's with a Spanish settler man, so you can get a little sneak peek of what the men wore in the 18th century in California. And she has what looks like maybe a bead necklace around her shoulders and neck, and either feather or grasses made into a skirt around her waist. But she's basically naked otherwise, and that was a very common thing that people talked about. All the different early reminiscences have talked about the nakedness of the people. In 1786, the French explorer La Perouse visited California and made several sketches of the Native Americans and the colonists whom he saw. And these are probably the next earliest accurate depictions of Northern California native dress. In 1791, the Spanish explorers with the Malaspina scientific expedition stopped at Monterey and created the next earliest group of illustrations of the local native peoples and the missionaries. So here we can see some fur or feather capes. We can see a little bit more detail of the skirts made of grasses and animal skins that the people are wearing, but they're basically otherwise naked. At this time also, several groups of Native Americans began to live at the missions. That was the purpose of the missions. The purpose of the missions was to train the Native peoples how to be Spanish citizens, essentially. So they considered what they were doing to be very socially forward, because most other people would not take the time to consider that the Native peoples were human and deserved to be citizens. And so despite the way that we look at their methods today, it was actually more progressive. The way that they went into the area planning to make the Native Americans, teach the Native Americans how to be citizens so they could be citizens of Spain as well. Of course, that was not necessarily successful in most cases, but here we see a man where he has some weapons, he has a loincloth, and so he's wearing a piece of clothing that the mission probably gave him, which was the loincloth or the breechcloth. The missions generally imported and wove wool and other, sometimes cotton. They tried spinning and growing cotton in Southern California later in the period and had a little bit of success, but mostly it was wool. They issued clothing to people every year. Everybody got a shirt and a blanket, and then the men also got a loincloth, and the women also got a petticoat. So here is a man with his weapons. He could have been, those could be his traditional weapons, or someone at the mission could have given them, because at this time also, people who began to master Spanish cultural components like language and various different ways of living like Spaniards were rewarded with Spanish-style clothing or weapons or more kind of responsible jobs. So if he was going out hunting for the mission, this is what the men would have been wearing. In an article published in 1892, Guadalupe Vallejo, the daughter or granddaughter of original colonists, recalled that in 1776, the regular 5 years' supplies sent from Mexico to the missions included 107 blankets, 480 yards of striped sackcloth, 389 yards of blue baize, and 10 pounds of blue maguey cloth. Maguey cloth is made of a certain type of like a succulent, like a fiber of, not quite a cactus, but it's a similar kind of plant. And these were woven under the father's personal supervision for home use at the mission and for sale. They were also taught to weave a coarse serge for clothing. It was between 1792 and 1795 that the governor brought a number of artisans from Mexico, and every mission wanted them, but there were not enough to go around. These included shoemakers, tanners, and a ribbon maker, and some weavers. Hemp was often also woven at Monterey. Cotton cloth was also made in a few cases in 1797. And the women were kept busy, of course, at textile pursuits. Here we see a sketch of Mission San Carlos with the natives and the Padres meeting with the La Perouse expedition in 1786. The Frenchmen, in their recognizably European clothing, are very distinct from the long row of native people dressed in their loincloths, basically, and nothing else. And of course, the Padres are there as well. But it's very interesting to see the state of the mission buildings in the background and just the very distinct separation between the native people and the Padres and the Frenchmen. In this detail from a sketch of Carmel Mission Plaza in 1791 by Jose Cordero, one of the artists who accompanied the Malaspina expedition, we see a bit more clothing on the native people, including what looks like a cloth blanket or cape, perhaps made from mission wool fabric, worn with a grass or feather skirt or apron on the women in the foreground. The native people are otherwise naked above the waist, some wearing loincloths, while at least one man appears completely naked, showing that this is still the norm more than 10 years after the Spanish settlement. Here's some more illustrations from Father Ignacio Tirsch's time in California. And these are probably the neophytes or the Native Americans who lived at one of the missions in Baja California. But the evidence, as we'll see later in the 19th century, suggests that people in Alta California, in what is now the state of California, wore similar things. So the women on the left are gathering prickly pear fruits, and they're wearing Spanish-style clothing. So I guess they've had more experience being in the mission system and gotten more used to it. You can see that they are wearing gathered camisas, or that's the chemise that they're wearing, and they're wearing that as their outer clothing. So again, there were concessions made for the native peoples who were not used to wearing much clothing at all. So in general, they tended to wear their one chemise or camisa and one petticoat or nagua as their outer clothing. And the girls, you can see, also have aprons. In this illustration there, you can see they're ruffling on the sleeves and around the neck of their camisas as well. On the right-hand side is another close-up illustration of some native peoples, and you can see the woman's ruffled camisa neckline, and you can see that the man is wearing not really a Spanish-styled shirt. If it were Spanish style, it would be gathered, it would have a collar, it would have a neckband, be much more European looking. So he is not wearing as much Spanish style clothing as the woman is, which is kind of interesting. So here are what the settlers or the Californios would have been wearing when they were living at the presidios and the pueblos. So when the settlers first came to California, most of the men were soldiers at the presidios or the forts, and they brought their families with them. There were a few settler families as well that just came specifically to be farmers and ranchers, and they would have been wearing basically the same thing that the man is wearing, except for the light-colored sort of decorative vest that he's wearing on the outside of his clothing. That is his cuero, or his leather jacket, which was essentially armor, body armor. So without the body armor, then he's essentially he would essentially be dressed as any other man would have been dressed in that time period. The soldiers were paid not so much in money as in supplies for establishing a new home in a new land, and they received also the promise of land ownership after 10 years of service. Now, this was a really attractive proposition for them because most of the settlers who came to California were mixed race and lower class. And so land ownership back in Mexico was not a possibility, was not an option for lower class people, especially lower class people of mixed race. So to come to California was a real step up for them in some ways. Anyway, I mean, they were going to a wilderness where nothing was, and nobody was there already, and they had to make it all from scratch, and that was extremely difficult. But they had that promise, that offer of land. The first party of soldiers and priests left northern Mexico in 1769, led by Gaspar de Portola and Father Junipero Serra. A second party of soldiers and settlers, led by Juan Bautista de Anza, traveled between 1775 and 1776. De Anza's supply list included these items, quote, wardrobe for a man, 3 shirts of good Silesian linen, 3 pairs of underdrawers of Puebla cloth, 2 cloth coats with lining and trimmings, 2 pairs of breeches with lining and trimmings, 2 pairs of stockings, 2 pairs of chamois skin boots, 3 pairs of gaiter shoes, 1 cloth cape lined with thick flannel, 1 hat, 1 ribbon for the hat and hair. So we can see both Father Ignacio Tircha's illustration of, well, the governor, soldier of California, not quite the governor, with his cuera, and get a little sneak peek of what the sort of little bit above working class women would be wearing. And then on the left, you can see an illustration from historian David Rickman, who is one of, if not the foremost historian of California that I have ever met or heard of. He has been studying California for at least 40 years, and he's an illustrator. And he did a series of costume illustrations for Sutter's Fort, and they have a costume manual. So some of the illustrations in this slideshow come from there, and he gave me permission to use them. So De Anza's wardrobe for a woman consisted of 3 shirts, 3 pairs of white Puebla petticoats, 2 pairs of petticoats of silk serge and thick flannel, and an underskirt, linen cloth for jackets, 2 pairs of Brussels stockings, 2 pairs of hose, 2 pairs of shoes, 2 shawls, 1 hat, 6 varas of ribbon. A vara is a measurement about equal to a yard, not quite. And then children's clothing supplies included Puebla cloth for linings, petticoats, and white trousers, thick flannel, linen for shirts, other unidentified cloth, hats, shoes, shawls, and ribbon for bands. I chose this illustration because it shows 3 different racial groups of women. One of the things about Spanish life or Hispanic life during that time period was that racial designations were usually, outside of California anyway, shown in the kind of clothes that the people wore, at least a little bit. So you can see none of the women are wearing caps, as would have been worn in non-Hispanic parts of Europe. The one who's wearing the most recognizably European clothing is the African-American woman in the center. She's got a gown on, and that's really interesting to see. But we have the other ladies, and we have the Native American maid who's wearing the same thing that the other Native American women were wearing in the other image. Puebla cloth, which was mentioned earlier, was a tightly woven wool or cotton fabric made in Puebla, Mexico, and it could be purchased in natural white or tan color or dyed with cochineal to make red or indigo to make blue, as cochineal and indigo were both grown or produced in northern Mexico. When the settlers arrived in San Diego, which was their first stop in what is today California, their supply of clothing that I listed earlier that they had been given at the beginning of their journey was so worn out and tattered that they could not keep themselves decently clothed, and they were resupplied at the mission. And so this image is showing a man and his wife who are bringing cloth to sell at the mission. This state of near poverty remained the rule during the first several years of Spanish settlement in California. Apart from the governor and his family, who resided at Monterrey, the capital, and perhaps the commander of each of the army presidios, there were no wealthy people importing European fashions and commissioning portraits of themselves and their neighbors in California during the 18th century. So here we see Father Tirsch's image of the governor of California and his wife and one of the soldiers. So you can see that her skirt, if you look closely, has quite a bit more decoration on it. Maybe it's embroidered silk, more decoration than the other women were wearing. She's got maybe gold lace on it, and on her jacket, her sleeve ruffles are a lot bigger than the other women. She's got more jewelry, but also she's not wearing a cap. She's wearing a mantilla, which is a veil made of lace. And that was a fairly iconic California thing. While we have the above descriptions of the clothes, there are no complete garments that are remaining from this time period in California that can be studied. So quite a bit of extrapolation is necessary in order to learn what those garments actually looked like. It can be assumed that the people would have made their clothes according to the pattern used by the lower and middle classes of northern Mexico in the late 1770s. Standard 18th century European patterns for generic working class shifts, petticoats, breeches, and shirts, as well as men's and women's simple jackets, can be adapted to match the available illustrations. The only exceptions to this are women's stays and caps, as I mentioned earlier. Historian David Rickman says that there is no indication that boned stays or corsets, as they were known in Europe anyway, were available in California until just before the gold rush. And none of the period images show California women wearing caps. The line of the women's bodices in Ignacio Tirsch's illustrations, however, indicates that some kind of stiffening must have been present, either in the bodices themselves or in a garment worn underneath, but no such garment has survived, and no account of any such garment has also survived. So we don't really know. Apart from the sketches that have already been shown, the most helpful source of detailed illustrations is a genre of portraiture called Casta paintings. Casta, or caste, as in racial group, paintings were a uniquely Spanish and Portuguese art form, combining the Enlightenment's obsession with categorization and naming and labeling, and the Iberian people's experience with racial, religious, and cultural identification and legal segregation through centuries of Moorish and then Christian rule. Each scene shows a man, a woman, and child in so-called typical costume and settings, illustrating the major pure-blood castas, Spanish or Espanol, Indian or Indio, and African or Negro or Moorish, which is said Moro, which can also mean Middle Eastern. And then it shows each casta, which results when people of these races have children together, and then each further casta when mixed race people have children with someone in one of the other castas. And these paintings are valuable because when you find paintings that were from Mexico, you can look in them and see similar garments to the ones that we see in Ignacio Tirsch's illustrations and in some of the other illustrations we have seen and some of the others that we will be seeing. So it generally provides just sort of like another view, maybe a more detailed, a clearer picture of what some of those garments probably would have looked like, which is helpful when it comes to trying to make your own version of these costumes. In most of the Spanish Empire, the casta a person belonged to also determined the legal, financial, and social status, and to some extent, the clothing of the individual. However, in California, the Casta designations were not so strictly applied, and as long as you were moderately prosperous and lived as a Spaniard, i.e. according to Spanish culture, you could own property and have the same social status and dress as other citizens who owned the same amount of property, no matter what your racial background was. So in these two illustrations, again, we can see the chemise on the women, the petticoat, or the camisa and nagua on the women. They have shawls or rebosos, which are the cloth version of the veils around their necks. And you can see that the men are wearing breeches, knee breeches with the waistcoat, with a sash, neck tie kind of thing on the man in the right. And notice that their hats are not huge and the brim's turned down. That's one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when costuming this time period of California, is they wear the Zorro or the sort of bullfighter uniform hats, and those are not correct for this time period in California. So when analyzing the images of 18th century California women, these are the common clothing elements. A white linen camisa, which was the shirt, with a medium to high neckline and no visible cleavage, usually edged with a gathered ruffle at the neck, and full elbow-length sleeves, also usually edged with a gathered ruffle that shows from beneath the jacket sleeves. A fitted wool or linen cuerpo or casaca. Cuerpo is bodice, casaca means jacket, also with medium-high round or square neckline, also with no visible cleavage, and the waist generally pointed at center front or with a peplum all the way around, and the pointed waistline look achieved with a stomacher. Let's see, it could be laced over a dark or contrasting stomacher, or laced or possibly hook and eye fastened closed edge to edge at center front. At least 2 ankle-length faldas, which is the skirt, or naguas, which is the word for petticoat. At this time period, skirts and petticoats were kind of interchangeable. Whichever one that you chose to wear on the outside, you could call that a falda. Everything else was a nagua, or they could all just be called naguas. It's not very specific in the documentation. Generally in solid colors for the lower classes, which everyone in California pretty much was, but the more, little bit above working class would have cotton print petticoats. And there's some interesting study going on right now, actually, about what those cotton prints looked like. Were they Indian chintzes? Were they knockoffs from England? It really depended where the Spanish merchants were getting their merchandise. There is an interesting paper that I just found, actually, that was studying printed cotton fabrics called indianillas that were being made in Mexico. And what's really interesting about this particular study is that the study is being done on a original manuscript from the 17th century that has original fabric samples sewn into the manuscript. So I will have to see if I can get permission to include a picture of those fabric samples in the document of extra images that I can send out to people later, and you can take a look. Otherwise, I'll just put the link to the study so you can see it for yourself. So again, continuing on, shoes would have been leather, brown or black leather, not too high-heeled, cotton or linen reboso draped around the head and around the shoulders, possibly hair braided, either in 1 or 2 braids hanging down or pinned up. You can't always see, that's the thing in the illustrations, you can't always see how the woman's hair is done, and so that's difficult. But what we do know is that they were not wearing caps and they were not wearing hats, except for when they were actually physically on horseback. And then they would have had a man's style hat, as we saw in that illustration of the soldier and his daughter on horseback. They were both wearing essentially identical hats. Here is the overview of the men's clothing, which includes a white linen or cotton camisa, also with no ruffles except maybe for the governor, but with a small collar, as you can see in some of the images. And calzoncillos, which are loose drawers that are underclothes. So we don't have a picture of the underdrawers in this slide, but they were hanging out, the white ruffly thing that was hanging out below the knees of the breeches in the other illustrations. That's what that was. Dark wool, velvet, or broadcloth calzones or breeches that have functional buttons at the side seam from the hips down, and they could be buckled or buttoned at the knee. A dark wool skirted abrigo or jacket, and with long sleeves and brass or other metal buttons to fasten at center front. A colorful striped fringed wool serape, either draped over one shoulder or later, closer to 1800, it would be with a hole in the middle for the head and worn with the ends either hanging down front and back or with one end hanging down the back and the front piece swung across the body and over one shoulder. They would have had white, black, or natural colored wool or cotton stockings and brown or black leather shoes, a wide red wool, silk, or cotton faja or sash around the waist. And generally in the images you see the men are clean shaven, hair shoulder length, perhaps longer. If it's longer, it's slicked back and worn in a queue, as they would have done in Europe as well. A wide-brimmed wool felt sombrero. In some illustrations, you see they're wearing a chaleco, which is just the waistcoat with no sleeves. Calcetas is the stockings. Zapatones is the shoes. And in some of the other illustrations, you saw the men wearing botas de talon, and those are the leggings that you saw, kind of like a big rectangle of leather. Essentially, it was wrapped around the lower leg below the knee and tied on with garters to protect the lower legs. Again, soldiers would have had on top of that their leather jacket or cuero. All right, so now we are moving to the 19th century. So for the turn of the 19th century, saw California still under the flag of Spain, isolated from almost all of the political and social events that were occurring even at the seat of government in Mexico City. The Mexican War for Independence, which lasted from 1808 to 1821, affected California only in that all shipments of supplies and pay for the soldiers and other government employees ceased completely because all ships were commandeered for the war effort. As a result, the strict trade laws in California were relaxed, as people were forced to trade with the English, the Russians, American fur trappers, and others in order to obtain the necessary supplies. This did not really change the Native Americans' dress much, except to make them the recipients of more blankets and other pieces of cloth made at the missions as imported trade items became more scarce. So here we see some Native Americans, not necessarily resident at the missions, but still wearing the breechcloths or the loincloths that they might have received from the missions, in addition to body paint, which is a lot more apparent in the illustration on the left, but that's a special event that they're dancing at. Probably the more normal look would be in the illustration on the right, again, mostly naked. According to Encarnacion Pinedo, granddaughter of the earliest colonists, quote, in the beginning, the neophytes or native Californians within the missions covered themselves with a piece of unbleached cotton and a blanket which the fathers gave them. Later they wore a coarse woolen cloth, which they themselves wore, and calico, which was furnished them by the fathers. Still later on, they wore blue trousers, blankets, and some of them wore shoes also. The women at first made for themselves petticoats of tule or coyote skins, but later they dressed in woolen cloth striped black and white, which they themselves wove on the loom, and unbleached cotton goods. White blankets with yellow stripes were also woven on the loom. The stripes were dyed with wildflowers that the Indians gathered. So here we can see on the right some of that striped fabric that Doña Encarnacion was talking about. The Museum of Natural History of Los Angeles County has a few fragments of fabric in their collection, which were found in a cave or in a series of caves on some of the islands off the coast of California nearest to San Gabriel Mission. And these fragments of fabric have been dated to this time period. The fabrics are woven of wool or other animal hair, and several fragments are striped in brown, green, yellow, and light blue. One color per fragment. I have not seen any of the fragments with more than one color on them. A couple of the fragments also show evidence of stitching, and one or two even have eyelet holes made in them. The museum did not give me permission to show images of these fragments in this slideshow, but they can be seen on the museum's online website, and I encourage you to look at them. I will include the link in the bibliography that I send out to people who request it. Here we can see two illustrations of more Native Americans from this time period. One from Monterey State Historic Park, and the other one in a boat in the San Francisco Bay. After 1825, California became a colony of Mexico, and the central government secularized all of the missions, essentially closing them and appropriating all of the property, which was granted in large ranches to Californios who applied for the land. When this happened, all of the mission Indians were turned out of their missions, and even though many stayed on the land, they were all forced to make their living in a different way. Some went back to their traditional lifestyle, but others made their way to the pueblos, where they obtained whatever work they could, and the rest became servants and employees of the families who received a grant of former mission lands. Through greater interaction with the settlers, they began to adopt the settlers' style of dress, and those who intermarried with the settlers entered the society of Californios. Historian David Rickman says that the white pajama look, commonly seen in reenactments today on Native Americans or on people reenacting Native Americans, was a myth invented in the 19th century by a historian. Due to this increased trade, manufactured goods from the United States, Europe, and Asia began to flood California markets and brought many new fabrics and trimmings to California wardrobes. Because they were brought by shiploads of male merchants, however, these goods were not accompanied by the fashion plates and women's magazines that were becoming increasingly popular elsewhere and that showed women how to make the clothes in the Western fashion. Therefore, Californios continued to make their most basic garments in the same 18th century styles for quite a few years into the 19th century. While there is some documentary indication that some women may have worn something like petticoats and unfitted short gowns in the 1810s and 1820s, there are no images of this outfit from California and no extant garments remaining. The two images that we see here are the only images from the first quarter of the 19th century that show California women, and they show intriguing hints of their costume. Unfortunately, in the image on the right, the women's rebosos cover up their entire outfits, but the silhouette suggests the narrow outline which was fashionable 15 to 20 years earlier than this picture was created. The image on the left shows a woman wearing a gown, either a shorter gown over a petticoat with a longer hem, or an apron over a gown. And these images were both made by another group of explorers, the Beachy expedition, and he brought some artists with him as well. Carlos Ijar, one of the leaders of the Ijar Padres colony of 1834, recalled how surprised he was by the quaint, old-fashioned dress of the local Californios, saying, quote, "The women wore tunics of calico, generally blue, always long in spite of the age of the individual. On their heads they wore a kerchief of black silk, doubled into various folds, and bound around the head in the manner of turban. The footwear was of chamois, with a more or less high heel, and with the tip of the shoe turned upwards," unquote. The Ijar Padres colony in 1834 was the last group of settlers to leave northern Mexico and come to California. Antonio Coronel, a historian who was also an early resident who arrived in California as a young man with the Ijar Padres colony, recalled that when he arrived, younger women favored gowns with a skirt so narrow that it was called a media paso, or half-step gown, but that older women and poor women still wore the petticoat and chemise as their only clothing. Unfortunately, there is no known media paso gown still in existence with the California provenance, but contemporary images from Mexico show interesting similarities. The image that we see on the left is part of a Mexican embroidery sampler, which has been dated by the Cooper Hewitt Museum to about 1848, but it shows a female figure wearing the fashions of the 1820s. And it is similar to the last image by William Smythe of the Beachy expedition, in that the woman is wearing a gown with a shorter hem over a longer petticoat. The image on the right is a cartoon from much later in the 19th century, comparing Mexican fashions of the 1820s to French and Spanish fashions of the same time period. However, the figure at the far left, the one that is second from the right, and the one that is third from the left with the rebozo wrapped around her shoulders and her head, are all showing outfits that are probably very similar to what was being worn in California at this time. Despite this, the most common mode of dress for California women, especially before the 1830s, was the shift or camisa and petticoat or nagua, worn with an apron or a sash around the waist, and a veil or rebozo around the shoulders and or over the head. Historian David Rickman notes that while the petticoat would have been made of colored or printed fabric, and it, like the shift, would have been embroidered, the outfit called china poblana, while similar, was not worn in California before about 1900, and then was worn as fancy dress costume. In addition, the popular ballet folklorico costume, while beautiful and well known in California, dates to a much later time period as well. In these images, we see a design for a Californio shift by David Rickman, with a typical embroidery pattern drawn out, and an original garment from about this same time period, which was said to have belonged to the wife of the bandit Joaquin Murrieta, who was killed in the 1850s. As in the 18th century, basic early 19th century petticoat and shift patterns from Europe can be altered to resemble the few images in original California garments that are known to exist. Here we see some images from the Workwoman's Guide, a sewing and garment making manual that was published in 1838, but contains garment shapes used through the entire decade, including simple petticoats and shifts. While there is little to no documentary evidence concerning women's underwear in California during this time period, and let's be real, the contemporary documents are almost exclusively written by non-Californio men, so how would they know? A few things can be assumed from what we know about what was worn earlier, what we can see was worn later, and what we can see from the few images that we have. While there is no evidence that stays or corsets, as they were known outside of California, were worn in California during the first quarter of the 19th century, it is fairly evident from the line of the woman's skirt in the image from the Beachy expedition that the woman has at least one full petticoat underneath her gown. What would that petticoat look like? The Workwoman's Guide includes two different styles of petticoats, one without an attached bodice and one with, The author states that the bodiced petticoat is more commonly worn as far as she knows. So here we see the waist petticoat image and the petticoat bodice image from the Workwoman's Guide, and an original bodice petticoat from the same time period, but without a California provenance. Either style is plausible for California, but again, we have no other evidence. Like the shift or camisa, the petticoat or nagua would have been decorated with embroidery. Antonio Coronel of the Híjar Padres colony recalled sewing was laborious, for the underskirts which they used had to be embroidered with the needle, which required a great deal of time and care. Here we can see two Mexican embroidery samplers from the 18th and 19th centuries, showing the colors, stitches, and patterns that were popular there, and which would have been similar to what was used in California. And you can see that all the patterns are kind of in the form of a strip of embroidery. So you can imagine those strips of embroidery edging a neckline, or edging the end of a sleeve, or edging a hem of a petticoat or of a chemise. The two Beachy expedition images that we saw earlier don't show the woman's shoes in much detail, but it is possible to see that they are flat shoes and are likely worn with stockings. Simple stockings, as would have been worn in other parts of the Western world, are probably the same as what were worn in California, and here we see two pairs of original flat shoes that date from this time period and have a California provenance, according to the Autry Museum. Men's clothing remains similar to what it had been in the 18th century, although keeping a bit closer to early 19th century fashion, since each new governor and each shipload of sailors wore the current styles when they arrived in California. In 1824, a new governor arrived from Mexico with the news that California was no longer under Spanish rule, but was now under the Kingdom of Mexico. Under Mexican law, the central government basically ignored California because it had continued unrest to deal with in Mexico City, but the Californios benefited from the new laws, which included free trade and loosened domestic business regulations. When the missions were secularized, some people were able to become self-sufficient and even begin to accumulate wealth. Americans, English, and other non-Hispanic immigrants began to arrive in small numbers at this time, and they generally adopted California fashions, taking Spanish names, joining the Catholic Church, as well as becoming Mexican citizens, purchasing rancho land, or marrying into a landowning family and then inheriting it. Here we can see two illustrations of some of the vaqueros or cowboys that were hired by the families to look after the huge herds of cattle that roamed the now very large ranchos that some families owned. And you can see they're starting to look a little more 19th century in their clothing. Here we see two original male garments from California in the early 1800s, a chaleco or waistcoat and a pair of calzones or breeches. They're typical in style and shape for waistcoats and breeches from outside California during the same time period, and patterns for these garments from the United States and England could be used to recreate modern versions of these for reenactors, again, altering them to resemble the illustrations that we have of California. Here we see a pattern drawn by reenactor Richard Grant and the calzones that he made from it in wool velveteen with brass buttons. This style would have been supplanted by the longer calzoneras among younger men after the Híjar Padres colony came to California in 1834. However, the older men would have continued wearing breeches for at least another 10 years. And into 20 years after, really, we see some illustrations of older men after the gold rush still wearing the breeches. Men's shoes took a turn toward the ornamental and even fanciful during this time period, as can be seen in historian David Rickman's illustrations of zapatones del Barrucci that belonged to early settler Antonio Coronel. Simpler zapatones are shown in the image to the right and would have been worn for active work and actual walking. Here we see the typical Californio attire in 1837 after the Hijas Padres settlers arrived, bringing their own fashions with them. The man is wearing the calzones with botas de talon tied over his calves, with a shirt and an American, or rather a sailor's style cravat, a kerchief around his head, and a rather romantically swirling cape. A serape would probably have been more commonly worn than a cape in reality. The woman is wearing a variation on the shift and petticoat outfit, with a fitted bodice with long full sleeves over her shift, a large manton de Manila, or fringed silk shawl from the Philippines, instead of a rebozo, and her hair pinned up with a decorative peineta, or comb. With new freedom to trade, and lots of foreign merchant ships stopping in California, the locals had their choice of manufactured goods, including fabric, to make into clothing. Reenactor Kimberly Palmer Wright says of Captain Juan Bautista Rogers Cooper's business notes that in 1828 he recommended that the following things be sold in California. Quote, white American cottons, American check, white muslin, dark blue broadcloth, red flannel, no other color, blue or dark velvet, mostly blue, calicos or women's prints in red, blue, and yellow, black and white lace, mostly white, all widths, gold and silver braid to trim military uniform jackets, ribbons of all kinds and sorts, colored shawls, 36 inches to 45 inches square, white silk stockings, also cotton, men's hats, mostly black, and from Canton, blue Nanking, red silks, and red crepes. Here we see some illustrations of the landowning class in California at this time period, the families that began to grow more and more prominent through not only military service of the men, but political service and their ownership of ranchos, large ranchos. Although the newly prosperous ranch owners tried to imitate what they knew of the lifestyle of the hidalgos, or aristocracy, in Spain and Mexico, California's remoteness made that difficult. Fashion, especially for women, borrowed certain ideas from mainstream European styles, but lagged by at least 5 to 10 years in other details, and returned certain old-fashioned elements much longer. Here, for example, in the circa 1850 image on the left, we see a woman wearing a black silk kerchief or pañuelo that Carlos Ijar mentioned being worn in the 1830s. We can also see some of the distinctive style elements that had become common in women's clothing at that time. The women in these portraits are members of landowning influential families, and they're wearing gowns in a more or less European style, with these differences: short sleeves and medium to low necklines for day wear, dark colored fabrics, and simple lines without the abundance of trimmings that were fashionable outside of California. The younger women are significantly also obviously wearing corsets or stays under their gowns at this time period because of the straight lines that their bodices make near the waist. Richard Henry Dana Jr.'s book, 2 years before the mast, which is essentially the journal that he kept when he was a merchant sailor to California in 1834, contains this description of California women's dress. Quote, the women wore gowns of various textures, silk, crepe, calicos, etc., made after the European style, except that the sleeves were short, leaving the arm bare, and that they were loose about the waist, corsets not being in use. They wore shoes of kid or satin, sashes or belts of bright colors, and almost always a necklace and earrings. Bonnets they had none. I only saw one on the coast, and that belonged to the wife of an American sea captain. They wear their hair, which is almost invariably black or very dark brown, long on their necks, sometimes loose, sometimes in long braids, although the married women often do it up on a high comb. Their only protection against the sun and weather is a large mantle which they put over their heads, drawing it close around their faces when they go out of doors. When in the house or sitting out in front of it, they usually wear a small scarf or neckerchief of a rich pattern. A band also about the top of the head with a cross, star, or other ornament in front is common." Unquote. Dana's claim about corsets not being in use is a bit controversial because, again, how would he know what the women were or weren't wearing under their gowns? But we can interpret his statement to mean that the dresses were noticeably looser fitting than the fashionable gowns that he was used to seeing back home, and he may have surmised that the women couldn't possibly be wearing corsets if he couldn't see the lines of the corsets under their bodices. The women who wore the shift and petticoat as their outer clothing certainly did not wear stays or corsets, but speaking as a reenactor and historic dressmaker, this style of gown fits really strangely, and the weight of the skirt hangs heavily if worn without any stiffening, either in a garment worn under the bodice or in the bodice itself, since the stiffening or the stays underneath support the weight of the full skirts. By the 1830s and 1840s, women's dress included not only the aforementioned gowns and petticoats, but also embroidered white or colored cloth rebosos, black lace mantillas or mantones de Manila, which were embroidered black or white fringed silk shawls from Manila, the Philippines, on their head and over the shoulders. In the image on the left, we can see Don Pio Pico, the last Mexican governor of California, with his wife and two nieces. The women are wearing the distinctive Californio fashion that foreigners found so quaint, including a manton de Manila on Don Pio Pico's wife, and Don Pio himself is wearing what any other American or European gentleman would have been wearing at the time. In the mid-1840s, political unrest broke out in California, and the Californios began to fight a war of independence from Mexico. Most non-California residents joined the effort, which resulted in California becoming an independent republic before joining the United States, just before gold was discovered in the region. This independence brought a lot more foreign settlers to California. Here's another illustration by David Rickman showing both options for California women's clothing during the second quarter of the 19th century, the gown and the shift and petticoat. William Maxwell Wood, who visited California in 1843, told of having attended a ball in Monterey and then calling on his hostess the morning after. Quote, "In the course of the morning following these revels, several of us called upon the ladies whom we had met at the General's, and first upon the General's lady, whom we found in a very domestic garb engaged in household duties. All upon whom we called were very much en deshabille, their dresses being of coarse materials, such as are worn by domestics in our country. They were, however, entirely unembarrassed, and gave us a kind-hearted and cheerful welcome. The common checked calico of their dresses probably cost their wearers more than the tasteful and fine articles worn by females in the United States. Some of the ladies, indeed, dispensed with the superfluity of a frock, and let the petticoat stand in for the outer garment of morning attire." Unquote. Here we can see some patterns, again from the Workwoman's Guide of 1838, for some plain fitted bodices and some short sleeves that can be made into a bodice for a dress that looks like the ones in the previous portraits, if you lengthen the waistline to the waist. The skirt should be made of about 4 yards of matching fabric, gathered or pleated to the waistline. Here we can see two more illustrations from David Rickman, the one on the left showing a woman wearing a black silk pañuelo or kerchief mentioned earlier. On the right is an image of a woman dressed for writing, the only time that she would wear a hat on her head, and even then it might be worn over a rebozo or suncloth pinned underneath her chin as in the illustration. Again, California women did not wear hats or bonnets until after the gold rush. An 1847 notice from the Californian newspaper, which was published in Monterey, reads, quote, "Politics at the Capitol. We can assure political squabblers that there is no great field for them here. The only discussion we have heard for a month past is that now agitated by the ladies, shall they or shall they not adopt the use of bonnets," unquote. Here are two other head coverings for California women, a black silk shanty lace mantilla and an embroidered silk manton de Manila. And I'm sorry about the quality of the photo, especially of the lace mantilla. I was trying to find a better quality photo this morning and was unsuccessful. On the left here is a detail from an 1845 watercolor painting showing the wives of vaqueros, or professional cowboys, still wearing the chemise and petticoat common to poor women, at least for their work clothing. Their rebozos are pulled back from their shoulders and wrapped around their heads in order to keep them out of the way while they're working. I have found through wearing a rebozo and trying to do kitchen work at the school where I work, that the rebozo hangs down and either obstructs the vision or unwraps itself from my shoulders and falls into whatever I'm doing, unless I do something like what they're doing. In the image on the right, we can see a vaquero, or cowboy, dressed as he would have been in the 1840s and 1850s, even though the painting was created much later. We can see he's wearing a short chaleco or jacket, and he's wearing calzoneras, which is the long trousers that were brought into fashion by the Carlos Ijar settlement party. On the left, here is an illustration from David Rickman showing what California men would have been wearing after the Ijar Padres settlers arrived and introduced the fashion for calzoneras. The image on the left is of a wealthy man, in particular a wealthy young man, wearing the new fashion. The image at center is of a less wealthy man in work clothes, still wearing the shorter calzones, with leather botas de talon, or leggings, covering his lower legs. Calzoneras and calzones would have been made of velveteen or wool broadcloth, but the calzoneras would have been heavily decorated, matching the short jacket as we can see in the image on the right. Richard Henry Dana, in 2 Years Before the Mast, describes California men's clothing in this way, quote, "Broad-brimmed hat, usually of a black or dark brown color, with a gilt or figured band round the crown and lined under the rim with silk. A short jacket of silk or figured calico, the European skirted bodycoat, is never worn. The shirt open in the neck, rich waistcoat, if any, pantaloons open at the sides below the knee, laced with gilt, usually of velveteen or broadcloth, or else short breeches and white stockings. They wore the deerskin shoe, which is of a dark brown color and, being made by Indians, usually a good deal ornamented. They have no suspenders, but always wear a sash round the waist, which is generally red and varying in quality with the means of the wearer. Add to this the never-failing poncho or the serapa, and you have the dress of the Californian. This last garment is always a mark of the rank and wealth of the owner. The gente de razón, or better sort of people, wear cloaks of black or dark blue broadcloth with as much velvet and trimmings as may be, and from this they go down to the blanket of the Indian, the middle classes wearing a poncho, sometimes something like a square cloth, with a hole in the middle for the head to go through. This is often as coarse as a blanket, but being beautifully woven with various colors, it is quite showy at a distance. And all those you can see in the picture at the right of the padrón, or the landowner. On the left is another illustration from the Workwoman's Guide of 1838, showing the shape of a man's shirt. This shape was standard for all social classes of Californios, which now includes the native Californians who lived on the ranchos and in the towns. And it stayed standard until after the gold rush, with perhaps a small collar coming off the neckband, as you can see in some of the illustrations. Antonio Coronel also recalled the men's clothing of that time. Quote, "The women made all the clothing for the priests and their husbands and brothers, and it was exacting work, for the cloth jackets were sometimes embroidered, stitched, and trimmed with braid. The vests, which were generally made of silk or cloth, also had to be well stitched and embroidered with colored silk thread. The short breeches also had to have some stitching and the buttonholes worked. The cloaks or serapes used by the men for riding on horseback of woolen cloth were made by the women. The head opening was bordered with velvet or fringe. The garters which they used to hold up their leggings were knitted of silk thread by the women, and ornaments which they put on them were very exquisitely worked of silk and bead to represent fruit, little animals, or flowers, etc. The men's shirts were also embroidered." Here are two more illustrations from historian David Rickman showing the calzoncillos, or underdrawers, which were worn underneath the calzoneras, and the calzoneras themselves. During and just after 1848, even non-Californio men, especially young men, adopted the calzoneras for their own wardrobes, at least for photographs. And I will include as many photographs of those young men during Gold Rush wearing Californio-style clothing as I can in the file of extra images that I will send out to people who request it. Here we can see 3 original calzoneras that are on display in different locations in California. 2 are made of wool, heavily decorated, and the third is made of leather, which has the edges cut and shaped in an ornamental manner. There are at least 2 others in different museums, but I wasn't able to get permission to share photos of them in this slideshow. And now we come to the all-important serape and the other kinds of wraps that Californio men wore. On the left is one last illustration from David Rickman, and on the right is an original saltillo serape from Mexico, featuring cochineal red as the main color. And finally, here we see some costumed reenactors who are dressed in Californio costume. Women in gowns and also in shifts and petticoats, with rebozos, mantillas, and montones de Manila. Here are some men, some costume reenactors in Californio costume, men in the calzoneras from after 1834 and in the calzones from before. The image on the right is a photo of Antonio Coronel himself with his wife Mariana, perhaps the original Californio reenactors. And this was the badge slide for the other conference that I gave this talk at. So we don't need that because there aren't any badges for this conference. So that is the end of the information that I have for everyone. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. Otherwise, you can leave if you like. I know we ran a little bit late, unfortunately. But if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I can answer them. Or you can feel free to go if you are done.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. It was very informative. I appreciate it.
Good, I'm glad. Hope it wasn't too boring with me just droning on and on.
No, I look forward to the additional documentation you mentioned, especially the excellent fabric samples.
Okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
You're welcome. All right. Okay, since we're about 11 minutes after 2, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Oh, there are some chats. Sorry, let me check that. I didn't see that until now. Okay, so very interesting. What groups are active now for reenacting? There are some groups, well, there were some groups at Sutter's Fort Historic Park and at Monterey. With the lockdown and everything, there is no idea of, that everything's up in the air. There are also some musical groups that perform in costume. Los Arribeños de San Francisco are out of Monterey, but there's also a group called Los Californianos who are in San Diego. Okay, saw this at Coco, but also sent money via PayPal. Okay, cool. Then I will send the file to you. Show what I'm wearing. Okay. How do you receive the notes and links? There is going to be a recording. I'm recording this currently. I'll go ahead and put the recording up on YouTube once it's finished processing. I don't know if I can show you what I'm wearing. Let's see. I'm essentially wearing the dress that I was wearing in one of the other illustrations. And it needs to be pinned, but but that I think is as far away from the camera as I can get. So yes, there's going to be recording the notes and links. I asked people to contribute $5 to me. I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat. And I will send the file of extra images that I was not able to include in the slideshow and the bibliography that I used for this information and some sources for further reading as well. So I think that's all. Oh, on my wearing stays, I'm wearing a 19th century style corset because my dress is of the style from the 1840s, just before the gold rush, where we could see those Leonardo Barbieri portraits with the women wearing tightly fitted bodices, where they were definitely wearing corsets at that time. So that is what I'm wearing. That is PayPal. So if you would like the images and the bibliography, that's PayPal. Any of the Oakland Museum pieces on display? I am not sure. With everything going on with the pandemic and the close down and lockdown and everything, I don't know what's on display anywhere. The images that I have were from their website. A lot of the museums have an online catalog that you can go search. A lot of things are not labeled Californio. So if you just go and search Californio, you may not come up with all of the images that of the items that they have, or even any. So you have to search trousers, or you have to search chemise or shift or slip or think of all kinds of alternate terms to search when you search museum online catalogs, and then just take a look at them and see which ones date to which ones have a California provenance, which ones date to before the gold rush, and then look at the pictures and see what they have. There's a lot still to be searched and found. A lot of museums don't know what they have. So if you can volunteer at your museum that might have any California items and volunteer at sort of recording their items and photographing them in particular and putting them online, that would be great. All right, I think that is all of the things in the chat. So I'm gonna go ahead and end. Oh, there's one new message, hold on. Thank you so much. All right, well, thank you for coming. I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting. Bye. Oh, it didn't end.